The morning sun cast long shadows across the mining town of Cedar Ridge when Sarah Martinez disappeared. She was only 16, with dark eyes that sparkled with dreams bigger than the dusty streets she walked every day. Her father worked the copper mines that stretched deep beneath the earth, and her mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families who owned the mining operations. Sarah had been walking home from her job at the general store when witnesses saw a black car with tinted windows pull up beside her. The car belonged to Blackwood, the most powerful man in 3 counties. Blackwood owned the mines, the banks, and most of the businesses in town. He also owned the sheriff, the mayor, and anyone else who might ask uncomfortable questions. The girl's screams echoed off the canyon walls as she was forced into the vehicle. Mrs. Henderson, who was hanging laundry behind her house, heard the commotion and ran toward the road. But she was too late. The car was already speeding toward the Blackwood estate, kicking up a cloud of red dust that seemed to swallow the girl's cries. When Sarah's parents reported her missing, Sheriff barely looked up from his newspaper. He told them that teenage girls run away all the time, especially ones who think they're too good for mining towns. But everyone in Cedar Ridge knew the truth. Everyone had heard the whispers about what happened to pretty girls who caught Blackwood's attention. The Blackwood estate sat on a hill overlooking the town like a castle watching over peasants. Behind its iron gates and stone walls, nobody could hear what happened inside. The servants who worked there never spoke about their employers' habits, and the few who had tried to leave town afterward were found days later in the desert, their deaths ruled as accidents. Sarah's father, Martinez, stood at his kitchen window that night, staring up at the lights in the Blackwood mansion. His hands shook as he held his coffee cup, and his wife sat at the table behind him, crying quietly into her apron. They both knew their daughter was somewhere behind those walls, but they also knew that calling the police again would be useless. The mining community was tight-knit out of necessity. When the earth could swallow a man whole with one wrong step, neighbors looked out for each other. Word spread quickly through the town that Sarah Martinez had been taken. Men who spent their days hundreds of feet underground, breathing coal dust and risking their lives for Blackwood's profit, began to whisper in the darkness of the mine shafts. James had been working the mines for 15 years. He had seen good men die in cave-ins while Blackwood cut corners on safety equipment. He had watched families lose their homes when workers got injured and couldn't pay their medical bills. But taking a child was different. That crossed a line that even fear of losing his job couldn't make him ignore. Lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of town. His wife had died of lung disease 5 years earlier, probably from breathing the toxic air that drifted down from the mining operations. He had no children of his own, but he remembered Sarah as a little girl, always carrying books and talking about becoming a teacher someday. The thought of her trapped in Blackwood's mansion made his stomach turn. 3 days after Sarah disappeared, her parents received a visit from one of Blackwood's men. The visitor was polite but firm. He explained that Mr. Blackwood was very sorry to hear about their daughter and he wanted to help. There was a job opening at his ranch in Montana, he said. Good pay, a house included, and they could start immediately. All they had to do was leave Cedar Ridge and never come back. Martinez looked at the envelope full of cash the man placed on his table. It was more money than he made in 2 years of mining, but his hands remained at his sides. He told the man that he wasn't leaving without his daughter. The visitor's smile disappeared. He reminded that mining accidents happened all the time, and it would be terrible if something happened to him too. After the man left, begged her husband to take the money and go. She was terrified that they would lose him too, but had made up his mind. He walked to James' cabin that night and knocked on the door. When answered, looked him in the eyes and said simply, "Help me get my daughter back." Invited him inside and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. The men sat in silence for a while, both understanding the weight of what was asking. Going against Blackwood meant risking everything, but had been thinking about Sarah for 3 days straight, and he couldn't get the image of her terrified face out of his mind. The next morning didn't report to the mines. Instead, he drove his old pickup truck to the next town over, where Blackwood's influence was weaker. He had a friend there who worked for the county surveyor's office, a man who might have information about the layout of the Blackwood estate, information that could help them find a way inside. While was gathering intelligence, walked through Cedar Ridge, stopping at the homes of men he had worked alongside for years. He didn't ask for help directly. Instead, he simply told them what had happened to Sarah and what Blackwood's man had offered him. Most of the men looked away and closed their doors. They had families to feed and couldn't risk losing their jobs. But a few listened. Carlos Vega, whose own daughter was Sarah's age, met eyes and nodded slowly. Tom Richardson, who had nearly died in a mine collapse the previous year while Blackwood was cutting safety corners, clenched his fists and asked what needed to be done. By evening, had 5 men willing to stand with him against the most powerful man in the county. The group met at its cabin after midnight, spread a hand-drawn map across his kitchen table, showing the layout of the Blackwood estate based on information from his surveyor friend. The property was larger than they had imagined, with multiple buildings and underground passages that connected to the old mine shafts. According to the survey records, Blackwood had been expanding his estate's basement for years, connecting it to a network of abandoned mining tunnels. The sheriff and his deputies patrolled the main roads leading to the property, but there were old access points to the mine system that had been forgotten when newer shafts were opened. Traced his finger along the map, showing how they could enter through an abandoned mine entrance about 2 miles from the estate. The tunnel system was dangerous, with the constant risk of cave-ins and toxic gases, but it would get them inside Blackwood's property without being detected. From there, they would have to find where Sarah was being held and figure out how to get her out alive. The men looked at each other around the table, each understanding that they were planning something that could get them all killed. Blackwood had money, power, and connections that reached far beyond Cedar Ridge. If they failed, their families would suffer the consequences. But the thought of a 16-year-old girl trapped somewhere beneath their feet was stronger than their fear. Spent the next 2 days preparing for what they all knew might be a suicide mission. He gathered old mining equipment from his garage, including rope and breathing masks that might protect them from toxic gases in the abandoned tunnels. His hands moved with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades working underground, but his mind kept drifting to the dangers they would face. The abandoned mine entrance they planned to use had been sealed off 10 years earlier after a methane gas explosion killed 4 workers. Blackwood's company had simply boarded it up and moved operations to newer, more profitable sections, but knew that desperate times called for desperate measures, and right now, that forgotten entrance was their only hope of reaching Sarah without alerting Blackwood's security. Martinez hadn't slept since his daughter disappeared. He spent his days walking the streets of Cedar Ridge, looking for any sign that might help them locate her within the sprawling estate. At night, he stood in his backyard, staring at the distant lights of Blackwood's mansion and imagining what horrors his little girl might be enduring. Tried to convince her husband to accept Blackwood's offer and leave town. She packed their belongings and pleaded with to think about their safety. But's jaw was set with determination that frightened her. He had always been a gentle man, but the disappearance of his daughter had awakened something fierce and dangerous inside him. On the 3rd night after their meeting, Tom Richardson brought news that changed everything. His wife worked as a seamstress and occasionally did repairs for some of the wealthy families in town. One of her customers, Mrs., had mentioned seeing a young girl in the window of Blackwood's mansion, crying and pressing her hands against the glass. The description matched Sarah perfectly. Mrs. had been delivering flowers to the estate when she noticed the girl in what appeared to be a basement window. The sight had disturbed her so much that she mentioned it to Tom's wife, not realizing the significance of what she had seen. Gathered the men at his cabin again to share this new information. According to Mrs., the window was on the east side of the mansion, partially hidden by landscaping. This aligned with the surveyor's maps, which showed that the estate's basement extended in that direction, connecting to the old mine tunnels. Carlos Vega had been having second thoughts about the rescue mission. He kept thinking about his own daughter and what would happen to her if he was caught or killed. But hearing that Sarah had been seen alive gave him renewed determination. If there was a chance to save her, they had to try, regardless of the risks. The group decided to move the following night. They would enter through the abandoned mine shaft, follow the tunnel system to the basement of Blackwood's estate, and search for Sarah. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only option they had. Reminded them that once they entered those tunnels, there would be no turning back. James had spent years exploring the mine systems around Cedar Ridge. He knew which tunnels were stable and which ones were likely to collapse. He also knew about the pockets of toxic gas that could kill a man in minutes and the underground streams that could flood entire sections without warning. But he had never attempted anything as dangerous as what they were planning. The abandoned entrance was hidden in a canyon about 5 miles outside of town, and drove out there the day before their planned mission to scout the location. The wooden barriers that sealed the entrance were rotting and could be removed without much difficulty. Beyond them, the tunnel disappeared into darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. Stared into that darkness and thought about his daughter somewhere on the other side. The tunnel represented their only hope of reaching her, but it also looked like the entrance to hell itself. The air coming from the mine carried the smell of damp earth and something else, something that reminded him of death. That evening, each man said goodbye to his family without revealing the true nature of their plans, told his neighbors he was going hunting for a few days, kissed his wife and promised her that everything would be all right. Carlos hugged his daughter extra tight and told her he loved her. They all knew there was a good chance they wouldn't be coming home. Tom Richardson had military experience from his time in the Army, and he took charge of organizing their equipment. Each man would carry a backpack with water, food, first aid supplies, and tools they might need to break through barriers or cut through metal. They also brought weapons, old hunting rifles and pistols that might give them a chance if they encountered Blackwood's security guards. The night of the mission arrived with a new moon, providing the darkness they needed to approach the mine entrance undetected. Drove them to a location about a mile away from the canyon, and they hiked the rest of the way on foot. The desert was silent except for the distant howling of coyotes and the crunch of their boots on gravel. When they reached the mine entrance, used a crowbar to pry away the rotting wooden barriers. The opening exhaled a breath of stale air that made them all step back involuntarily. Tom Richardson tested the air with a gas detector he had borrowed from a friend who worked in industrial safety. The readings showed elevated levels of methane, but not enough to be immediately deadly. One by one, they entered the tunnel with leading the way. They cut through the darkness, revealing walls of rough-hewn rock and ceiling supports that looked ready to collapse. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, and water dripped constantly from overhead, creating a rhythmic echo that seemed to count down the seconds until disaster. About half a mile into the tunnel, they reached the first major obstacle. A section of the ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving an opening barely large enough for a man to crawl through. Went first, testing each handhold and foothold before putting his full weight on it. The others followed one at a time, their hearts pounding as loose rocks scattered into the darkness below. His mind was focused entirely on Sarah as he crawled through the narrow opening. He imagined her voice calling for help, and it gave him the strength to ignore the claustrophobia that threatened to overwhelm him. Behind him, Carlos was breathing heavily and mumbling prayers in Spanish, while Tom Richardson maintained the steady composure of a soldier advancing toward enemy territory. 2 hours after entering the mine, they reached a junction where 3 tunnels branched off in different directions. Consulted his hand-drawn map by the light of his, trying to determine which passage would lead them toward Blackwood's estate. The air was getting thinner, and they were all struggling to breathe normally. The tunnel they chose led them deeper underground, following what had once been a rich vein of copper ore. The walls were with tool marks from miners who had worked these passages decades earlier, and occasionally they found abandoned equipment rusting in forgotten alcoves. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their labored breathing and the drip of water from above. After what felt like hours of walking through the maze of tunnels, held up his hand to signal a stop. Ahead of them, a faint light was visible, different from there. It was electric lighting, coming from somewhere beyond a bend in the tunnel. They had reached the edge of Blackwood's underground domain. The men gathered in a circle and spoke in whispers, reviewing their plan one final time. Beyond that bend, they would be in hostile territory where discovery meant death. But they had come too far to turn back now. Sarah was somewhere ahead of them, and they were her only hope for rescue. Checked his watch. It was 3 in the morning. The estate would be quiet with most of Blackwood's staff asleep. This was their best chance to find Sarah and get her out before anyone realized they were there. He looked at each man's face in turn, seeing the same mixture of fear and determination that he felt himself. Took point as they approached the bend in the tunnel, driven by a father's desperate need to save his child. The electric lights ahead grew brighter, and they could hear the faint hum of generators powering Blackwood's underground facility. Whatever they found around that corner would determine whether Sarah lived or died. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that took their breath away. Blackwood had excavated far beyond what any mining operation required, creating a subterranean complex that stretched in multiple directions. Electric cables snaked along the walls, powering lights that illuminated corridors carved from solid rock. The air smelled of machinery and something else that made stomach turn. Had expected to find a simple basement, but this was something far more sinister. The chamber was divided into sections by metal barriers and locked doors. They could hear the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the complex. Blackwood had built an underground fortress, hidden beneath his mansion where no one could witness what happened inside. The men crouched behind a pile of mining equipment, studying the layout before them. To their left, a corridor led toward what appeared to be living quarters. Straight ahead, another passage disappeared into darkness. To their right, a staircase carved into the rock wall led upward, presumably toward the main house. Tom Richardson pointed toward the living quarters, remembering Mrs. description of seeing Sarah in a basement window. If she was being held somewhere in this underground maze, that seemed like the most likely location. But they could see at least 2 security cameras mounted on the walls, their red lights blinking steadily in the dim lighting. Carlos Vega pulled a small mirror from his pocket and used it to check around corners, a technique he had learned during his brief time in the military. The corridor leading to the living quarters was empty, but they could see light coming from under several doors. Someone was awake down here, even at this hour of the night. His hands shook as he gripped his rifle. Every instinct told him to charge down that corridor, kicking in doors until he found his daughter. But he knew that would only get them all killed. They needed to be smart about this, even though every second of delay felt like a betrayal of Sarah's trust. Noticed something that made his blood run cold. Along one wall of the chamber, there were metal plates mounted like memorial plaques. As he looked closer, he realized they bore names and dates. Young women's names with dates spanning the last 15 years. Sarah's name wasn't there yet, but the implication was clear. The sound of approaching footsteps made them all freeze. Someone was walking down the corridor from the living quarters, boots clicking against the stone floor. The men pressed themselves against the wall, weapons ready, as a security guard rounded the corner. He was a large man in a uniform, carrying a flashlight and a radio. Tom Richardson moved with the silent precision of his military training. He approached the guard from behind, wrapping his arm around the man's throat in a sleeper hold. The guard struggled briefly, but lost consciousness without making a sound. They dragged his body behind the mining equipment and tied him up with rope from his backpack. The guard's radio crackled with static, and a voice asked for a status report. Tom quickly grabbed the radio and responded in a gruff voice, saying everything was quiet. The person on the other end seemed satisfied and signed off, but they all knew it would only buy them a limited amount of time before someone came looking for the missing guard. With the immediate threat neutralized, they moved quickly down the corridor toward the living quarters. The first door they encountered was locked, but Carlos had brought lock-picking tools from his days as a locksmith before he became a miner. His hands worked quickly in the dim light, and within minutes they heard the soft click of the lock opening. The room beyond was empty, but it was clearly designed to hold prisoners. There were chains mounted to the walls and a single bed with leather restraints. The sight mate's vision blur with rage, but grabbed his arm and reminded him they needed to stay focused. Sarah wasn't here, which meant she was still alive somewhere else in this underground hell. They checked 3 more rooms, finding evidence of other victims, but no sign of Sarah. Each empty room increased their desperation and their fear that they might be too late. But in the 4th room, they found something that gave them hope. Sarah's school backpack was sitting on a chair, along with the clothes she had been wearing when she disappeared. Picked up one of Sarah's textbooks, and a piece of paper fell out. It was a note written in Sarah's handwriting, clearly intended for anyone who might come looking for her. The note said that she was being held in the room at the end of the corridor, and that Blackwood visited her every evening around midnight. She also warned that there were guards posted throughout the complex. The timestamp on Sarah's note indicated she had written it 2 days ago. His heart raced as he realized his daughter was not only alive, but thinking clearly enough to leave clues for potential rescuers. It gave him renewed hope that they could get her out of this nightmare alive. As they approached the end of the corridor, they could hear voices coming from behind the last door. One was definitely male, deep and authoritative. The other was younger and female, pleading and afraid. Recognized his daughter's voice immediately, and it took all of his self-control not to kick down the door immediately. Held up his hand, signaling for patience. They needed to know exactly what they were dealing with before making their move. Tom Richardson crept closer to the door, listening carefully to determine how many people were inside and whether they were armed. Through the door, they could hear Blackwood's voice explaining to Sarah why she should stop fighting and accept her situation. He told her that her parents had taken his money and left town, abandoning her to her fate. It was a lie designed to break her spirit, but they could hear the effect it was having on her voice. Sarah was crying, begging to be allowed to go home. She promised she wouldn't tell anyone what had happened if he would just let her leave. Blackwood's response was cold and calculating, explaining that she belonged to him now and would never see the outside world again. The conversation revealed that Blackwood was alone with Sarah, which gave them the element of surprise they needed. But they also heard him mention that his evening visit was almost over, and he would be returning upstairs soon. If they were going to act, it had to be now. Looked at his companions, seeing his own determination reflected in their faces. They had come this far through dangerous tunnels and past armed guards. They weren't going to let Sarah spend another minute in the hands of this monster. Nodded toward the door, and they prepared to make their move. Tom Richardson positioned himself to kick in the door while the others their weapons. Carlos kept watch on the corridor behind them, making sure no other guards were approaching. Checked his watch one more time, calculating how long they had before the missing guard would be discovered. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor indicated that Blackwood was preparing to leave the room. This was their moment. Tom Richardson took a deep breath, stepped back, and drove his boot into the door with all the force he could muster. The door splintered off its hinges and crashed into the room. Was the first person through the doorway, his rifle trained on Blackwood. The wealthy mine owner spun around in shock, his face going pale as he realized his private underground kingdom had been invaded. Behind him, Sarah sat chained to a bed, her face streaked with tears but her eyes suddenly blazing with hope. Blackwood reached for a pistol on the bedside table, but was faster. The sound of gunfire echoed through the underground chamber as both men fired simultaneously. Blackwood stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, while shot went wide, chipping stone from the wall. Sarah screamed her father's name as rushed to her side, working frantically to break the chains that held her to the bed. Tom Richardson kept his rifle trained on Blackwood, who was bleeding but still conscious and still dangerous. The sound of their gunfire would certainly bring more guards running. Carlos burst into the room with news that made their situation even more desperate. He had seen lights coming on throughout the underground complex, and they could hear boots running in their direction. Blackwood's security team was mobilizing, and they would be trapped in this room within minutes. His hands shook as he struggled with the chains binding his daughter. The metal was thick and the locks were designed to prevent escape, but desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Sarah was conscious and alert, though clearly traumatized by her ordeal. She kept whispering "Papa" over and over as if she couldn't believe he was really there. Tom Richardson dragged Blackwood away from the bedside table where his pistol lay. The mine owner was bleeding from his shoulder wound, but still defiant, threatening them with consequences they couldn't imagine. He told them that his men would kill them all and that their families would pay the price for their foolishness. Found a set of keys hanging from Blackwood's belt and tossed them too. The third key he tried fit the locks on Sarah's chains, and they fell away with a metallic clatter that sounded like freedom itself. Sarah threw her arms around her father's neck, sobbing with relief that he had come for her. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by shouting voices and the static of radio communications. Blackwood's security team was organizing a systematic search of the complex, and they would reach Sarah's room within minutes. The rescue team needed an escape route, but the way they had come was now blocked by armed guards. Carlos reported that at least 6 guards were moving through the corridors, carrying automatic weapons and wearing body armor. They were professionals, not the small-town sheriff's deputies that most of the miners were used to dealing with. These men were trained killers who wouldn't hesitate to shoot anyone who threatened their employer. Studied the room they were in, looking for any alternative exit. The walls were solid rock, carved directly from the underground chamber. But in one corner, he noticed an air vent that was larger than the others. It might be big enough for a person to crawl through, though he couldn't be sure where it led. Sarah was weak from her captivity, but determined to help with her own escape. She told them about a service tunnel she had seen during her time in the underground complex, a passage that Blackwood's men used to move between different sections without being seen. It connected to the main chamber through a hidden entrance behind a false wall. Tom Richardson used his knife to pry open the air vent while helped Sarah to her feet. She was unsteady but mobile, and her eyes had regained the spark of determination that had always defined her character. Even after days of captivity and psychological torture, she hadn't given up hope of escape. The air vent opened into a narrow maintenance tunnel that ran parallel to the main corridors. It was barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through, and the air was stale and difficult to breathe. But it offered a way to move through the complex without being detected by the guards who were now searching every room. Went first, followed by Sarah, then the other men. They could hear Blackwood shouting orders to his security team from the room they had just left, describing the intruders and demanding that they be captured alive. His voice carried a note of panic that suggested he understood the implications of his underground prison being discovered. The maintenance tunnel was a maze of intersecting passages that served the electrical and ventilation systems of the complex. Tried to navigate based on his knowledge of the mine layout, but this artificial network was different from the natural cave systems he was familiar with. They had to guess which direction would lead them back toward the abandoned mine entrance. After crawling for what felt like hours, they emerged into another section of the underground complex that appeared to be used for storage. Crates and boxes were stacked against the walls, and the air smelled of machine oil and chemicals. But more importantly, they could see daylight filtering down through a grate in the ceiling. The grate led to what appeared to be a maintenance shed on the surface of Blackwood's estate. Through the metal slats, they could see the gray light of early dawn and the silhouettes of trees. They were close to freedom, but they still needed to get through the grate and across the estate grounds without being detected. Tom Richardson climbed up and examined the grate, finding that it was secured with heavy bolts from the outside. But the metal was old and corroded, and he thought he could break it free with enough force. The noise would certainly alert any guards in the area, but they were running out of options. Sarah suddenly grabbed her father's arm and pointed toward a different exit from the storage room. She had noticed something the men had missed in their focus on the overhead grate. There was a door partially hidden behind stacked boxes, and light was coming from underneath it. It might lead to another way out. Moved the boxes quietly, revealing a door that opened onto a staircase leading upward. The stairs were concrete rather than carved stone, suggesting they led to a more recent addition to the complex. At the top, they could see another door with frosted glass panels that let in natural light. The staircase brought them to a basement level of Blackwood's mansion, in what appeared to be a utility room filled with heating and electrical equipment. They could hear voices and movement from the floors above, indicating that the entire household was now awake and searching for the intruders. Checked his watch and realized they had been underground for over 6 hours. The sun was rising, which meant their window of opportunity for escape was closing rapidly. In daylight, they would be easily spotted crossing the estate grounds, and Blackwood's men would have every advantage. Through a small window near the ceiling, they could see the driveway of the mansion and several vehicles parked outside. Among them was a large truck that appeared to be preparing for departure, its engine running and guards loading equipment into the back. It might provide cover for their escape, but they would have to time their movement perfectly. Sarah was struggling with exhaustion and the emotional trauma of her captivity, but she refused to slow them down. She told her father that she could run when necessary, and she understood that their lives depended on reaching safety before Blackwood's men found them. Her courage in the face of everything she had endured amazed the men who had risked their lives to save her. The utility room had another exit that led to an outside stairwell at ground level, but the door was equipped with an alarm system that would sound if they opened it without the proper code. They were trapped between the underground complex behind them and an alarmed door ahead of them. Carlos suggested they might be able to short-circuit the alarm system using tools from the utility room. He had some electrical knowledge from his work in the mines, and he thought he could disable the door alarm if given enough time. But time was the one thing they didn't have. The sound of footsteps on the stairs behind them indicated that Blackwood's men had found their escape route. The search was methodical and thorough, checking every possible hiding place in the underground complex. Within minutes, the security team would reach the utility room and trap them there. Made a decision that surprised everyone. He told the others to get Sarah out through the alarmed door, regardless of the consequences. He would stay behind to slow down the pursuing guards, giving his daughter and her rescuers time to escape. It was a father's ultimate sacrifice, trading his life for his child's freedom. Sarah refused to leave without her father, clinging to his arm and begging him to come with them. The sound of approaching boots grew louder, accompanied by radio chatter as the guards coordinated their search. In moments, they would burst through the door and the rescue attempt would end in failure. Tom Richardson had been studying the alarm system while the others argued about their next move. He noticed that the door had been modified recently, with new wiring that didn't match the original installation. It was possible that the alarm system wasn't properly integrated, which might give them a chance to escape without triggering it. Grabbed a crowbar from the utility room's tool rack and positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs. If the guards came through that door, he would make them pay dearly for every step. But he also knew that their weapons and training gave them an overwhelming advantage in any direct confrontation. The decision was taken out of their hands when the lights in the utility room suddenly went out. Someone had cut power to this section of the building, plunging them into darkness just as they heard the door at the top of the stairs begin to open. They were out of time and out of options, with armed guards closing in from above and an uncertain escape route ahead of them. In the sudden darkness, Tom Richardson made a desperate gamble. He kicked the emergency exit door with all his strength, hoping the alarm system would malfunction in the power outage. The door burst open with a crash of metal, but no alarm sounded. Whether by luck or divine intervention, they had found their way to freedom. Swept Sarah up in his arms and ran toward the open door, followed closely by the other men. Behind them, they could hear guards shouting and flashlight beams cutting through the darkness of the utility room. The sound of boots clattering down the concrete stairs told them their pursuers were only seconds away. They emerged into the pre-dawn grayness to find themselves in a service area behind Blackwood's mansion. The truck they had seen earlier was still running, its engine noise masking the sound of their escape. But between them and the perimeter fence lay 200 yards of open ground with no cover. Spotted a drainage ditch that ran along the edge of the property, carved into the hillside to channel rainwater away from the mansion. It was their only chance of reaching the fence without being seen. One by one, they dropped into the shallow trench and began crawling toward freedom. Sarah's strength was failing, but she gritted her teeth and forced herself to keep moving. The rough concrete of the drainage ditch scraped her hands and knees, but each yard brought her closer to safety. Behind her, she could hear her father whispering encouragement, telling her that they were almost free. Guards with flashlights began pouring out of the mansion, shouting orders to each other as they organized a search of the grounds. The beams of their lights swept back and forth across the lawn, missing the drainage ditch by inches. But it would only be a matter of time before someone thought to check the area where they were hiding. Carlos reached the perimeter fence first and found that it was topped with razor wire designed to keep people both in and out. But he had brought wire cutters in his backpack, anticipating this obstacle. Working as quietly as possible, he began cutting through the chain link while the others provided cover. The sound of approaching footsteps made them all freeze. A guard was walking directly toward their position, his flashlight beam getting closer with each step. Pressed himself against the side of the ditch, shielding Sarah with his body, while Tom Richardson prepared to attack if they were discovered. The guard stopped just feet from their hiding place, speaking into his radio to report that the perimeter appeared secure. For agonizing seconds, he stood directly above them, his boots visible at the edge of the drainage ditch. Then he moved on, continuing his patrol toward another section of the property. Carlos finally broke through the fence, creating an opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. Went first, then helped pull Sarah to safety on the other side. Followed, his heart pounding with the realization that his daughter was finally beyond Blackwood's reach. As Tom Richardson squeezed through the opening, they heard the sharp crack of gunfire from the direction of the mansion. Blackwood's men had found the utility room and were now searching the grounds with renewed urgency. Flashlight beams were sweeping in their direction, and they could hear dogs barking in the distance. The men had parked pickup truck about a mile away, hidden in a canyon where it wouldn't be spotted by Blackwood's patrols. But crossing that distance on foot while carrying an exhausted teenager would be nearly impossible, especially with armed guards and tracking dogs closing in behind them. Sarah surprised them all by finding the strength to run. Whatever horrors she had endured in captivity had not broken her spirit, and the sight of open desert ahead of her gave her energy she didn't know she still possessed. She ran beside her father, stumbling occasionally but refusing to slow down. They reached Truck just as the first rays of sunlight began illuminating the desert landscape. In the distance, they could see vehicles leaving Blackwood's estate, beginning a systematic search of the surrounding area. But the old pickup started on the first try, and soon they were racing down dirt roads toward the safety of Cedar Ridge. Held his daughter in the passenger seat while drove, taking back roads he had learned during his years of hunting in the desert. Sarah was shaking with exhaustion and trauma, but she was alive and free. She kept repeating that she had known her father would come for her, that she had never given up hope. As they approached the town, they could see police cars and emergency vehicles in the distance. But these weren't Blackwood's corrupt sheriff's deputies. Carlos had used his cell phone to call the state police and the FBI, reporting the kidnapping and the underground prison they had discovered beneath the mansion. The rescue had exposed Blackwood's criminal empire to law enforcement agencies beyond his influence. Federal investigators were already en route to Cedar Ridge, armed with search warrants and the authority to bring him to justice. The wealthy mine owner's network of corruption was about to collapse under the weight of his own crimes. Sarah was taken to the hospital for medical evaluation, but her physical injuries were minor compared to the psychological trauma she had endured. Her parents never left her side during the long process of recovery, and gradually she began to reclaim the bright, determined spirit that had defined her before her ordeal. The investigation of Blackwood's estate revealed the full scope of his crimes. The underground complex contained evidence of multiple kidnappings and murders spanning 15 years. The memorial plaques had seen belonged to young women who had never been reported missing, girls from poor families whose disappearances had been ignored by corrupt local officials. Blackwood was arrested at a private airport as he attempted to flee the country. Federal charges included kidnapping, murder, human trafficking, and racketeering. The evidence found in his underground prison was overwhelming, and he was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The corrupt sheriff and several of his deputies were also arrested and charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The entire law enforcement structure of the county was cleaned out and replaced with officials who couldn't be bought or intimidated by wealthy criminals. James became a local hero, but he never sought recognition for his role in Sarah's rescue. He continued working the mines until his retirement, using his knowledge of the underground tunnels to improve safety conditions for other workers. The courage he had shown in facing Blackwood inspired others to stand up against injustice. Martinez received job offers from mining companies across the country, but he chose to stay in Cedar Ridge. He wanted Sarah to grow up in the community that had around his family in their darkest hour. The town had learned that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept evil as inevitable. Sarah Martinez graduated high school 2 years later as valedictorian of her class. She had originally planned to become a teacher, but her experience had changed her perspective on life. Instead, she decided to study criminal justice with the goal of becoming an FBI agent who specialized in finding missing children. During her graduation speech, Sarah talked about the darkness that exists in the world and the courage required to bring light into that darkness. She thanked the men who had risked their lives to save her, but she also emphasized that every person in the audience had the power to stand against injustice when it mattered most. The abandoned mine where their rescue mission had begun was permanently sealed and turned into a memorial for Blackwood's victims. A bronze plaque at the entrance bore the names of all the young women who had disappeared over the years, ensuring that their memory would not be forgotten by future generations. Cedar Ridge itself began to change after Blackwood's arrest. New businesses moved into town, attracted by mining operations that were now run ethically and safely. The community had learned that they didn't have to tolerate corruption and abuse, that ordinary citizens could make a difference when they found the courage to act. Tom Richardson used his military experience to start a private security company that specialized in protecting vulnerable people from predators like Blackwood. He trained other veterans and law enforcement officers in the techniques they had used during Sarah's rescue, helping to create a network of protectors across the region. Carlos Vega became an advocate for mining safety, working with unions and government agencies to ensure that workers were protected from the kind of exploitation Blackwood had practiced. His own daughter grew up knowing that her father was a hero who had helped save an innocent girl's life. The story of Sarah's rescue spread far beyond Cedar Ridge, inspiring other communities to stand up against powerful criminals who thought they were untouchable. It became a reminder that evil could only flourish when good people chose to remain silent and passive. Years later, Sarah would return to the memorial at the abandoned mine entrance, bringing flowers for the women who hadn't been as fortunate as she had been. She would stand in silence, remembering the darkness beneath the earth and the men who had been willing to enter that darkness to bring her home. The plaque at the memorial bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of what had happened in Cedar Ridge. They took her beneath the earth, but love brought her back to the light. It served as a testament to the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary acts of courage when someone they loved was in danger. Sarah's story became a symbol of hope for other families whose children had been taken by predators. It proved that no criminal, regardless of wealth or power, was beyond the reach of justice when determined people refused to give up. The light had triumphed over darkness, and that victory would echo through generations to come.